Hi, I want to give a very brief overview of Michael Huemer's paper, America's Unjust Drug War, which is widely reprinted, reposted online in various places, I think, and is available off his webpage here. So the main questions of this article are this. Is it an injustice to imprison people for drug use? Related, is it wrong for the government to punish people with prison if they use drugs? And people who call themselves prohibitionists, who are called prohibitionists, say, no, it's not an injustice. It's not wrong to do this. Legalizers, on the other hand, say, yes, it is an injustice. Yes, it is wrong. So that's the question, and it's mostly about what the government does. So the question isn't, could using or abusing drugs be a bad choice, a non-wise decision, or even morally wrong? And it's not; these aren't the questions we're focusing on because the answers there are probably pretty easy. Um, so, why, according to prohibitionists, should drug users be punished with prison? I would encourage you to ask around and find some prohibitionists and see what they have to say. Huemer reports that if you ask them, and if you look at the materials they produce, they will say this. They say that people who use drugs should go to prison because if you use drugs, this might happen. You might harm yourself or others in various ways, such as you might die, you might be injured, you might waste your money or lose all your money, you might lose your job or not get a job. If you use drugs, you might fail all your classes, you might fail out of school. You might ruin your relationships. You might disappoint your family. You might become a bad person, a morally bad person if you use drugs. You might cease to care about people anymore. You might not work to improve your community. You might not participate in democracy because you use drugs. You might no longer have free will if you use drugs. There are other potential bad consequences of using drugs. So, in response to this, Huemer has a number of versions of the Howard cases. And the basic story is that Howard is this guy who has many or all of these characteristics. And the question about Howard is, should Howard go to prison because he's like this and is basically a loser? And the obvious answer is no. It's too bad that Howard is a loser in these various ways, but, should we imprison him for having ruined his relationships or, not caring about other people, or he did something that injured himself or harmed himself in various ways? And the general answer seems to be no. So this takes Huemer to this principle. If it would be wrong because it's not part of the government's legitimate functions to punish people for directly bringing about some result, then it would also be wrong to punish people for doing some other action on the grounds that the action has a chance of bringing about that result indirectly. So basically, Howard basically directly brought about these bad results for himself. Let's suppose he chose to do many or all of these things. Should we imprison him for directly bringing about those results? No. Given that, it makes no sense to punish people, imprison them for using drugs on the chance that they might become like this if they use drugs. So here's his principle. So here's the sort of prohibitionist general argument. And you could apply this to other arguments or other reasons that prohibitionists might give. And I bet many of them will fit this sort of formula or schema. So drug use might lead to people doing or being X. And here X is fill in the characteristic. To get to the conclusion that drug users should be imprisoned for doing drugs, you have to think, well, anything that might lead to people doing or being this way X should be punished with prison. And the point of the Howard examples and other examples from daily life about, drinking, smoking, being unhealthy in various ways, making ordinary bad decisions surrounding careers or financial decisions or relationships or educational choices. There's all sorts of things that might lead to harm. And premise two would sort of seem to imply that you should be imprisoned for doing that. So the general theme is this argument, and the verdict on this is this type of argument seems to provide no good reason to imprison drug users. There is one possible exception. Um, if drug use would lead somebody to do something that they really should be imprisoned for, such as sometimes people use drugs and that leads them to act in very violent ways. Well, Huemer acknowledges that if that were to happen, it would make sense to restrict that type of drug use if it's really going to lead people to do things that they really should be imprisoned for, such as act out violently towards others. So, but in general, this form of argument does not seem to provide a good reason to imprison drug users, Huemer argues. All right, here's the legalizer's arguments. The legalizer first thinks that, well, we just have no good reason to believe that imprisoning drug users is just or fair. The prohibitionists gave their arguments, and their arguments are no good for the reasons that we saw briefly, and of course, Huemer presents in far greater detail, and you will see when you read the article. And the next, potentially more interesting argument and clever argument, I think, is the claim that, look, we have a right to use drugs, a natural or moral right to use drugs. Why is that? Well, we have a right to our lives, we have a right to our bodies, we have a right to our minds, and since we have all those rights, and these are natural or moral rights, not necessarily legal rights, that would mean that we have a right to use drugs. Um, you know, drugs affects people's minds, and if people want to affect their minds in various ways, their mind is their mind, so they have a right to do that. So, in conclusion, um, unjust imprisonment is really, really bad for people who are imprisoned and very bad for their families. And I can add a recommended reading, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. She details how the world is set up such that if people get out of prison, life will be very, very hard for them in most cases. So that just sort of adds to the injustice. So, and Huemer argues, of course, that if you're imprisoning people for drug use, this is an unjust imprisonment. People are imprisoned for no good reason because the arguments in favor of imprisoning them are no good. They're unsound. And imprisoning people for exercising their natural rights is, well, just an injustice. It's wrong. And he concludes about the importance that we all need to speak out against injustices wherever they are found, even if it's not popular, because that is something that has contributed to overcoming various injustices in the past, righting various wrongs, and we can only hope that that will continue making an effect into the future. All right, this is a very brief overview. Make sure you read the whole paper because this was just the overall gist. Thank you.